Oh, how extensive was the Pennsylvania Railroad plan to replace passenger service with buses? We know about Philadelphia, Atlantic City, and there are others. Yeah, the answer is not much. It started out, there was, even before World War I, Pennsylvania Railroad executives were aware of the potential of bus transportation. Not so much to replace existing passenger services, but to augment them, to prevent the construction of like competing interurban lines. And so they sent a team to Great Britain to look at coordinated rail bus service in Britain, and they came back and said, we're not impressed. They said, there's certain things in Britain that make it more favorable for bus service, like shorter distances between, rail and off-rail destinations because of the denser rail network. The roads are better, blah, blah, blah. But I said, even there, we just don't think it's viable, and it certainly isn't viable in the United States. Let's just leave it be. Interestingly, the one of the team that they sent over there, his son then became one of the lead people involved in Transcontinental Air Transport project. So anyway, for what it's worth. After World War I, with the proliferation of all-weather highways, and especially in the late 20s and early 30s, there was a brief period where buses were all the rage. There were articles about, traveling by bus and everything. It was exotic, romantic, whatever. Any of you seen It Happened One Night, the film? Okay, that's sort of an homage to the bus, right? And at the time, people thought bus travel would just mushroom. It didn't, right? It was never, the bus was never a threat to the Pennsylvania Railroad's passengers. It was the car. In any case, it's very clear if you look at Pennsylvania Railroad internal correspondence that the executive said, we're going to blanket, they actually literally use that word blanket. We're going to blanket our service area with bus routes to kill the competition. So they were very clearly, this was a way of using the economic power of the Pennsylvania Railroad, not just capital, but I mean, think about it. A lot of highways paralleled Pennsylvania Railroad tracks, which meant that buses could use Pennsylvania Railroad stations and ticket offices. If the bus broke down, they had access to Pennsylvania Railroad mechanics. If the bus broke down en route, oftentimes the bus driver could simply walk along the railroad right-of-way that paralleled the highway and use a railroad call box to call for help. And independent bus lines didn't have any of those support facilities, right? They had to start that up from scratch. And so it's very clear, and the ICC, and not so much the ICC, I guess, but state regulatory agencies said, whoa, wait a minute. You're trying to kill independent bus service in our state. And they were right. It was very clear that Pennsylvania Railroad was trying to undermine independent bus operations. And in the end, it never worked out anyway. Pennsylvania Railroad partnered with Greyhound. Greyhound had its own agenda, and they managed. Anyway, it's a long story, but yeah, there was an extensive, and New York Central did the same thing, by the way. Similar kind of operation, and it became really peripheral to the Pennsylvania Railroad's operations, and neither helped them or hurt them really. I think in large measure they never used RDCs because, well, for one thing, the Pennsylvania Railroad spent a lot of money in the post-war period, immediate post-war period, on new passenger equipment, conventional passenger equipment. And what's interesting is even as they were ordering new equipment, even by 1947, there are memos going around. Clement is savvy enough to realize this. By 1947, Clement is saying intercity rail passenger travel is dead. I mean, this is not a 1950s thing. This is 1947. He says we are in a serious problem here because rail travel, intercity travel is disappearing, and it's never coming back. And yet we're getting all these new cars that haven't even delivered yet. So what are we going to do about this? So one thing is that the PRR very quickly had a surplus of passenger equipment, more than they needed. So they didn't need to order RDCs by the time RDCs came out. And for other, they had already kind of killed off much of their branch line service. They were very consciously trying to get down to core operations like New York, Chicago, New York, St. Louis, New York, Washington, that kind of thing, where they had a chance, at least, of maintaining some market share. And so the thought that they would invest money in RDCs for branch lines, it was just, no. If they were going to do anything, they were going to try to get out of that service entirely. So. Yeah, yes and no. Atterbury, again, personalities matter. And Atterbury, again, to be able to spend a couple hours talking with him would be remarkable. But he, I think, very sincerely believed, even as he was countenancing like bus service to undermine the competition, he was trying to kill off independent truck lines, bus lines. There's no question about that. But he sincerely believed in the potential of integrated rail transportation, and he was fascinated by technology. Now, Atterbury died in 1935. He would have, if he lived, he would have had to retire, I think, in 1937, or maybe it was 38, 37, anyway, right around there. But if you can imagine Atterbury kind of being 5 or 10 years younger and continuing as president to say 1940 or 41, the duplex steam locomotive program never would have happened. Pennsylvania Railroad would dieselize far sooner than it did, probably. I really think that's the case. As far as the Zephyr, he was enthralled by the Zephyr. He arranged for not the Zephyr, but the M10,001, the second of the Union Pacific Streamline train sets. He had arranged to have it brought to Philadelphia, it was parked in Broad Street Station, open for tours. And when it was open for tours, he was in New York. He wasn't there. He was actually pretty sick by that time. But he said to a reporter, he said, the Zephyr is an example of modern pioneering. He was really enthralled, and that contributed to the formation of what they called the Unit Train Committee. Now, when he died, Clement took over, and one of the first things that Clement did was to say, no Zephyrs. He said, he was dismissive. He said, trains like the Zephyr are appropriate for Western railroads with thin traffic. And to a certain extent, he was right, given the limitations of the Zephyr at the time. And I was actually there, and not, it's in Chicago at the Center of Museum of Science and Industry, and it's a beautiful display. And you walk through it, and like, if you haven't seen it before, and you walk through it, it's a small train. It's a tiny little train. It's almost like a toy train. Yeah. You have to literally duck to get inside. Yeah. Once you're in, it's fine. But what Clement said, and he's right, is a train like that could never have accommodated the enormous passenger loads the Pennsylvania Railroad was dealing with over long distances like New York, Washington, New York, Chicago. Couldn't be done. What Clement never seemed to kind of wrap his brain around, he said the same attitude about diesels, is that in 10 years, the technology was going to be vastly better. He didn't really anticipate that. And I think Atterbury probably was Clement was too pessimistic. Atterbury was saying too optimistic in saying, here's what we can do. So again, had it's one of these great unknowns. Had Atterbury lived, or had he trained a successor who kind of thought like him, I think a lot of the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad in terms of passenger service, motive power, and stuff would have been vastly, vastly different. And yes, electrification too, but yeah. Yeah, the Transcontinental Air Transport Service, they was trained from so-called Airway Limited. That was really a second section of the Rainbow, I think. The American, yeah. It ran from Penn Station to actually outside of Columbus for a was then to Port Columbus Airport for a transfer to Ford Tri-Motors. And then they flew west to Waynoka, Oklahoma, and then transferred to Santa Fe for the remaining distance. Atterbury never, I don't think he ever envisioned TAT as a mechanism for mass transportation. He said, this is a niche market for very affluent people who are willing to pay a premium for the novelty of flight. We're not going to make any money on it, but it's good PR, and who knows what's going to happen. And I personally, Atterbury said, I mean, he saw him with Lindbergh, right? He loved him. He's like, oh my God, it's Charles Lindbergh. He was just like thrilled by, and he had himself photographed in front of TAT planes and everything else. What did that in was, well, there's a series of crashes. The Mount Taylor crash was bad, but there were a bunch of others around the same time. It's very air travel in 1930 was 13,000 times. 13,000 times more dangerous than rail travel on a fatality for passing by. Yeah, it makes you wonder why anybody would have stepped into a plane. And so it was, the speaking of publicity, right? The publicity associated with the accidents, and of course the Great Depression that put the kibosh on it right there. And so it was, and then for a variety of reasons, technology, regulation, and so forth, formation of Civil Aeronautics Board, whatever, commercial aviation was kind of set apart as its own thing, separate from the railroads. Yeah.
The South Jersey was a test bed for Pennsylvania Railroad.
It was, yeah.
You know what executive initiated that? Yeah.
Yeah, it was, I mean, Ray probably was the one who kind of was overall in charge. A lot of it would have been done by the Gibbses, right? By Alfred Gibbs, who's a PRR person in the motor power department, and his cousin George, who's a consulting engineer, Gibbs and Hill. And they work pretty closely together. But so it would have been ultimately Cassatt who authorized it, but the whole New York improvements, at least the engineering part of it, was Ray's thing. I mean, Cassatt was busy with Charles Full and McKim designing the big building, but it was Ray who was really responsible for the practical elements of it. So he probably would have been overall in supervising that. Yes.
Can you comment on the editing process that you go through with a work of this scale? I mean, were you happy with the editors, or did you have to do a lot of compromises, or what can you say on that?
Not much, actually. I'm very fortunate. I think with the first volume with Penn Press, they thought they were almost done with me, and so they probably were conciliatory, or maybe they were just overwhelmed, and they said it's easier just to give in than to fight him. I mean, I'm not trying to be critical of Penn Press. I think we had a pretty good relationship that, and somehow I think they changed their editorial philosophy over the years. With Indiana University Press, they've been great. I mean, it's very interesting because the publishing process, you have to submit a proposal, right? Which means basically an outline, sample chapters, everything like that, before, and then the editor of the book series recommends it to the governing board of the press, and they either approve it or not. Usually they do approve it if the editor recommends it. But when I went with IUP, when they agreed to publish it, I was in the odd position of having like not just one but two books written, but no contract. Usually, you get the contract first, then you write the book. So they said, well, for form's sake, we can't give you a contract until we get a proposal. So I had to like reverse engineer the book and write proposals for two books, send it. It was all wink, wink, nudge, nudge, pro forma, and they just signed off on it. And then once I sent the chapters, I mean, the manuscripts were peer reviewed, right? So we went over it and checked for factual accuracy and readability and so forth. But they made very few changes. I was very fortunate. Maybe they let me get away with too much. I don't know. I mean, nobody yet has told me that I should have written a much shorter book or whatever, but maybe I should have. I don't know. I mean, you listen to me for the last hour and a half, you can see I tend to go on and on and on. So I don't mean to, but it's just I find this so fascinating. There's so much involved. And so I basically just said, look, I mean, this is my project, my book's doing my way, and nobody ever said, oh, you got to cut this or change that, except for when Penn Press said, no, we can't publish 2 more volumes. Interesting story. I think I should. It's not really confidential. It's not confidential, but so after this whole process was taking place, some of you may know Dan Cupper, who's the editor of Railroad History. And Dan and I were having lunch together, and he asked me, this is a couple of years ago, how the process was going. I told him the story about that, how Penn Press wanted a single volume, and wound up being 3, and they didn't want to publish the last 2 and so forth. And Dan said, well, interestingly, they approached me before they approached you about writing this book. And for a variety of reasons, Dan, was committed to other things, he couldn't do it. But he said, I told them, I said, there's no way that you can have a 1-volume history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's got to be 3 volumes. So, they knew even before they talked to me about this so-called 1-volume history that one of the experts in the field had said, it's got to be 3 volumes. I mean, I was the only one who was like, okay. But it's one of those things that, things just kind of work out. So I mean, that may not be a good answer to your question, but it's just, I was fortunate, let's put it that way, but more often than not, I talk to people, they've had good experiences with their publishers. Occasionally there are horror stories, but not often. So. Yes.
Was Tom Scott part of the Scott Brothers Trucking organization?
No, different. Scott. I mean, I'm not going to say that there was absolutely no, but I mean, they may have been 18th cousins 5 times removed, but no, there's no direct relationship. No, it's way before. So, I mean, it's a fairly common name, and like I said, I won't absolutely swear that there's no like distant relative there, but no, there's no family connection. Yes.
That Frank Roosevelt avoiding using the Pennsylvania Railroad?
Yeah, there are stories like that. Harding too, allegedly, because Harding, who is a Republican, right, and politically, pretty closely aligned with Atterbury, but for political reasons, Harding was just dismayed at Atterbury's intransigence, stubbornness involving the shopman strike, and allegedly Harding refused to travel by PRR because of that, which I don't think is true. I think it's logistical reasons, but he went by B&O instead when he left from Washington. What turned out to be his final trip, right? He was heading for Alaska, and he came back and died in Seattle. But he was in Kansas City, and he said, transportation is, I can't do the quotation exactly, he said, transportation is integral to this country's future. And, some executives refuse to acknowledge their responsibility. He didn't mention Atterbury, but it's clearly. And I don't know that FDR was ever that critical of Atterbury. But I don't know. I've never seen any document that says, well, Roosevelt's not going to set foot on the Pennsylvania Railroad property at all.
Have you had any communications with the Pennsylvania Railroad T1 Trust?
They have not, no, which is probably a good thing, because I have I'm not an engineer. I have no I mean, I know obviously about the history of the T1 and what happened and what might have been and everything. But in terms of like the mechanical or engineering aspects of it, there's nothing I do to help them whatsoever. But I mean, wish them luck. It's an enormous undertaking, and they're making, I think, what I've seen, very good progress with that. But no, I haven't been involved in that at all. So, yes.
In your researches, have you been able to contact some of the descendants of some of the people who work for the Carolina presidents or anything?
Yeah, I've talked to a few people. Jad Roberts, by the way, who's a descendant of George Brooke and everything. But talked to a descendant of Assad, I think. Yeah. But I mean, just in conversationally, not to kind of get any information. Early in the process, I interviewed a few people who were management level in the PRR before 1968, and asked them a few questions. I elected not to use that information or even make reference to those interviews, because in some cases, they were critical, I think unjustly critical. In other words, I couldn't get any corroboration of what they were saying about certain individuals. I won't say who said what about whom, but it was some pretty critical stuff. And I said, I'm not going to put that in unless I can get some other independent verification. There were cases too where, unfortunately, some of the people I talked to, let's just say that their memories were a little kind of sketchy about some of the stuff. And ultimately I said, the sample size is too small. I'm not going to rely on a very, very small number of executives when so many of the people involved in the decision-making process before 1968 are just, gone. So I kind of backed away. Plus, I'm not a big, I personally always feel uncomfortable interviewing people. I feel much more, this is, we all have our strengths and weaknesses, and one of mine is interviewing. I'd much rather sit in an archives and just look through paper and things like that.
Said they were somewhat critical, were they like personnel of the company?
Yeah. Especially in the late stages of the PRR's history and the early stages of Penn Central. As you can imagine, there were a lot of executives, his fault, their fault, not my fault, and I just like, I don't want to perpetuate that unless I can really get some more solid evidence about it. And it's really important, some people, there's a very brief, speaking of Penn Central, there's a very brief kind of prelude in which I talk about the formation of Penn Central, collapse of Penn Central, 3R Act, 4R Act, Conrail breakup, NS, CSEC, and all that kind of stuff. In just a few pages, but I wanted to, I thought about doing an epilogue and talking about all that, and I, didn't want to add the extra pages, and I wanted to end the book with the end of the railroad, which is 12:01 a.m. on February 1st, 1968. So I wanted to just end there and not leave Penn Central, Conrail, all that for later. Somebody else,
What's your next book going to be?
Speaking of Conrail, there is a possibility. I actually have a contract with Indiana University Press to write a history of Conrail. Sort of, maybe. I don't know. It's in negotiation. I'm talking to someone who actually is a former Conrail executive about the possibility of. I've never collaborated with anybody on a book project before, so it'd be an interesting challenge. But I'm excited about it. I think this other person is excited about it too. It's a matter of like getting some sources lined up and things, but it's possible that we will co-author a book on Conrail, which I think would be because there's some stories relating to Conrail, and I don't think there's a really good, solid kind of history of the whole Conrail experience.
How many classes do you have?
We're on what we call a 3-3 load. That means I teach 3 classes fall semester and 3 classes spring semester. So it's it keeps me busy. Let's put it that way. It used to be 4-4, and then there's some reorganization of the university that got down to 3-3, which makes things easier. And since the pandemic, of course, I've been doing a lot of online teaching, which in some ways is not very satisfying because I can't do what I'm doing here and interact with actual physical people in a shared space. But it, actually does free up a certain amount of time because the lectures, are recorded and they can kind of learn at their own pace and just ask me when they have questions and things. So that makes it a little bit easier. But yeah, it's one of my responsibilities.
What was your attraction to the Pennsylvania Railroad as opposed to like the Union Pacific or the New York Central?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the turbo train experience. Actually, I grew up in Columbus, like half a block, I guess, from the what used to be a Pennsylvania Railroad and then became Penn Central Branch Line to Mount Vernon. Eventually went up all the way to Cleveland, but it had been cut back, stopped at Mount Vernon. So I was born in '64. So obviously I was only like 4 years old when PRR proper went away. But as a little kid, I would hear the train. Of course, I want to see the train. I ran out and see the train, and my dad would take me to the Union Station in Columbus. If you've ever been there, the concourse goes out over the tracks, so you stand there, and the National Limited went through there, usually very late at night, but you could see freight diesels parked there and everything. And so that was, that was the big news in railroading when I was growing up, was Penn Central and everything, especially given that era. But if you had said 25 years ago, are you going to write a massive history of the Pennsylvania Railroad? I would have said, no. But things happen, and so I've always been, very fortunate. I think that interesting projects have come my way, and this was certainly a big one and a very interesting one. It's kind of landed in my lap. So, like I said, if I'd known in advance it was going to be 21 years and all this, I might have said, really. But Yeah, it's interesting because the academy, that is, universities are more and more moving to, quickly deliverable results, crank out articles, crank out books, 1 year, 2 year publication cycles. And honestly, I think what I would say is if you were a younger version of me sitting there and saying, should I do what you did? I'd say absolutely not. You put your career in jeopardy by taking 21 years to complete a project because you need to get tenure, you need to get promotion to associate professor, you need to produce something every year. So better you turn out, a bunch of sort of, who cares articles that get published like right now than just keep telling your department chair and your dean that eventually you're going to get this massive project done. So I was very fortunate that I had chairs and deans and said, it's like, I'm not sure I believe you, but I'll trust you to, you say you're going to do this. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, it was for 20 years, almost exactly from 1881, when the PRR acquired the Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore. It then became the largest corporation in the world, and then it lasted until 1901 with the formation of U.S. Steel, the so-called world's first billion-dollar corporation, and all that. And obviously, there's a symbiotic relationship between railroads and the steel industry. Carnegie certainly started as a PRR executive and realized he can make more money by supplying stuff to the railroads than he could by working for the railroads and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there's a reason why his first big steel mill was named for J. Edgar Thompson. So. Oh, and last thing, I saw the comment in the chat about the Metroliners and so forth. Yeah, the Congressional fleet and the Metroliners are really the only significant PRR investments in passenger service after about like 1948, 49. I mean, yeah, there are experiments like the Aerotrain that never went anywhere, but yeah, very early on, PRR executives concluded that the only route that had any chance of turning even a modest profit, even meeting above the rails costs, right, was New York to Washington. And they were just saying, look, we got to consolidate trains, curtail and abandon everything, maybe Harrisburg, but everything west of Harrisburg's gone. We eventually get rid of it. And so hence the investment in the Congressional fleet, which was a drop in the bucket compared to the number of older cars that were used in that service. And the Metroliners is a long story about that. It's going to be in volume 3, and it's, as you might expect, very politicized. But it was one of these kind of ungodly mismatches between the Pennsylvania Railroad's involvement. What they wanted to do was get as much of a government subsidy as possible to buy additional pretty much conventional passenger equipment to upgrade equipment and make modest improvements to the tracks between New York and Washington. And they got tied in with initially the Commerce Department, later the DOT, that had a very different agenda about, basically like a Shinkansen sort of style. And so in the end, it was a very much a money-losing proposition for the PRR that they got roped into doing something that the federal government wanted them to do. Largely for political reasons and not what they wanted to do. Anyway, but that's in volume 3. Yeah. Well, and people from interesting. We talk about the duplexes, the 1930s. George Gibbs with Gibbs and Hill. He was meeting with Pennsylvania Railroad executives, and the Pennsylvania Railroad people involved with were like, duplex, right? S1, T1, fast, powerful. And George Gibbs like, no, listen. It's not the locomotives and the cars that are the limiting factor. It's the roadbed. If the roadbed is not up to it, I don't care what kind of motive power cars use, you're not going to be able. And they didn't listen to him. And then a generation later, when all this Metroliner, people like Lewis Clowder from consulting and other consulting, and they were saying, mainly, to be fair, not PRR people, government people, DOT, Department of Commerce, DOT people, like fast Shinkansen, modern Bud cars, lots of instrumentation, mechanics. And Clowder was saying, listen, it's not the equipment that's the limiting factor, it's the condition of the roadbed. This roadbed was laid out 150 years ago. You can't, I don't care how good the equipment is if you don't fix up the roadbed. And they didn't listen, So it's an interesting, the same, what's old is new again sort of thing. Yeah.